Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to Oslo this morning, and I'd like to start by inviting the Minister, Ms. Siv Jensen, the Norwegian Minister of Finance. I'd like to invite her to the podium to kick off this morning for us.
Dear Madam Chair, OECD delegates, experts and regulators, welcome to Oslo and welcome to the 11th OECD Conference on Measuring Regulatory Performance. The conference is hosted jointly by the Norwegian Government Agency for Financial Management and the Norwegian Better Regulation Council on behalf of the Norwegian government. We will address an important challenge faced by governments all over the world. How should we make good laws and regulations today and in the future, given the rapidly changing world around us? It will give us an opportunity to learn and explore important and exciting topics for all interested in ways of regulating behavior and products. Good regulations, good laws are essential in a good society. A law written more than 1,000 years ago in Norway, in the time of the Vikings, describes it aptly. With the law, the land shall be built, and it shall not be ruined by unlawfulness. Laws have been formed over time, and each law has been developed based on the problems and technology of that time. With different problems and different technology today, it may be time to make laws and regulations in new ways. And I'm glad that this conference here in Norway gives us a good opportunity to reflect on the important work of making sure our laws and regulations are fit for the future. Please allow me first to introduce you to some elements of the Norwegian regulatory system. In Norway, we have a long tradition for making rules about how to make new rules. Our aim is that regulations are adequately studied before they are enacted. And we have formulated these requirements as an obligation to answer 6 basic questions. What is the problem and what do we want to achieve? Which measures are relevant? Which fundamental questions are raised by the measures? What are the positive and negative effects of the measures? How permanent are these and who will be affected? Which measure is recommended and why? And lastly, what are the prerequisites for successful implementation? I believe several OECD countries have similar frameworks. We have found these questions a good and catchy tool for communicating our duties to carefully consider public measures. To avoid wasting both public and private money, we truly must ask ourselves, what is the problem we want to solve in a given case, and what do we really want to achieve? The Norwegian Government Agency for Financial Management, our co-host today, plays an important part in providing guidance and managing our instructions for official studies. Consulting the public about proposed regulation is also a central building block of the Norwegian regulatory system. Moreover, we have established an independent oversight body that scrutinizes the basis for proposals of business, regulation, and the regulatory impact assessments accompanying them. That is the Norwegian Better Regulation Council, also co-hosting this conference. This conference will address evidence-based policymaking in a rapidly changing world. You will be discussing how to use data to do reality checks for laws. You will debate the possible need to adjust traditional regulatory tools. For instance, how to better suit regulatory impact assessments for the new technological realities. The traditional way of developing regulation is to assess the possible consequences of different measures, consult with the affected public, and then decide and enact regulations. Is this still a valid and relevant procedure? How well can we assess the effects of innovation? How should we collect data that makes it possible to learn and adjust rules over time? These are important questions to ask. In doing so, we must not lose sight of the qualities and strengths of our current systems. Rather, we must keep our basic values for good regulations and laws. And these should still be based on good and inclusive processes and on sound knowledge and principles. Transparency and the rule of law is as important as ever. Because as you all know, the challenges are many and large. New technology changes society fast in fundamental ways. New products and new ways of delivering these products are constantly developed. Governments may lack experience and knowledge when they consider whether there is a need for regulations. It's difficult to make sure that current regulations are adapted to the advances in technologies. On the other hand, the same technologies may provide new data that gives better possibilities to regulate and to evaluate how regulations actually work. With data, however, comes challenges of digital privacy and security. One example of transformative technologies is the emergence of net-based platforms such as Google, Facebook, and Amazon. These play increasingly important social and economic roles. They could represent a huge potential for better lives for many and for economic growth. However, the sheer size of these platforms give them dominant positions. They will be able to strongly influence the conditions for other service providers. And this situation poses challenges for regulatory authorities, as does the fact that these platforms are used all over the world. Our societies are more complex and interconnected than before. Something happening on one side of the globe may also affect countries on the other side, literally in a matter of seconds. New products are evolving much faster than before, and suddenly this spring, for example, hundreds of electric scooters filled the streets here in Oslo, taking us by surprise. Soon people asked, was there a need for new regulations? In fact, my colleague in the Ministry of Transportation had already decided that these scooters should be regulated as bicycles. And maybe that is it. No further problem to solve. An example with more far-reaching consequences is also worth mentioning. Some of the problems of the financial crisis 10 years ago were caused by new techniques for spreading risks. But the regulatory regime lagged behind and the crisis followed. So let me express some efforts and challenges from a Norwegian perspective. Many of the challenges of transformative technologies relate to the development of information and communication technology. In addition to regulating this technology in a prudent way, we must make wise public investments in technology to improve public services. We have high ambitions in this field. This year, we appointed a Minister of Digitalization, and just a few days ago, he launched the new digital strategy for the Norwegian public sector, following our digital agenda for Norway 3 years ago. Information and communication technology is important for innovation and productivity in the Norwegian economy and is essential in the further development of public services. In addition to emphasizing that public services must be user-centric and seamlessly integrated, a priority in our digital strategy agenda is digital-friendly regulations. We aim to support innovation and development of digital solutions in the private and public sector, bearing in mind that digitalization also will lead to increased data sharing. That will require alertness in regulating data protection and information security. A successful example of user-centric services is our tax administration. My generation used to spend hours filling in numbers in the annual tax return, searching for the correct figures in letters filed neatly away. Now, the tax administration fills in our annual tax return for us, collecting data digitally from employers and banks. This is easier for all, and it gives us possibilities for reducing public budgets. We have better services in many areas, and I believe we have achieved a lot and transformed the way we communicate with our citizens. However, as a Minister of Budget, I notice that it is difficult to see this progress reflected in reduced public spending. and I see few examples of budget reductions caused by new technology. Norway, as most OECD countries, will face huge challenges in meeting healthcare needs for an aging population in the years to come. The abilities that new technologies offers to monitor the health of each individual may create a large market over time. Can we regulate this market in a way that eases the burden on the public health care system? Alternatively, will this new expansion of health information rather increase the pressure on the traditional public health care? I have a hope that transformative technologies will not only give us useful services, but also ease the burden on public finances. Welfare technologies can prove to be a good example of this. However, to reach that goal, it demands of us that we take care when regulating the technology. Most countries face the same kind of challenges, and this calls for international cooperation. Based on expertise from various fields, we need to be ahead of the curve and regulate smarter and possibly also more flexible in the future. Our aim should not be more regulations, but smarter regulations. And in this work, we need to learn from each other. The OECD is an important vehicle for such learning. And let me also add, some rules will only work as intended if they are part of an international set of rules. And I think that the OECD has an important role to play here. This conference is a part of a broader agenda from the OECD Regulatory Policy Committee. And there is a plan to deepen its work related to the impacts of emerging technologies over the coming 2 years. The effect of digitalization is one important aspect and at the center for this conference. However, there are also other areas to investigate. And I note that the committee plans to work with how to regulate ride-sharing services, artificial intelligence in autonomous transportation, drones, and even gene editing related both to human medicine and agriculture. These are all examples of emerging technologies that evolve so fast and are so complex that no country on its own may handle them in a prudent way. And as a Minister of Finance, I'm particularly interested and engaged in how to meet the tax challenges arising from digitalization. It is not a part of the work of this committee, but the OECD has an important role as promoter of a global consensus-based solution and to provide directions in the ongoing work. Lawmaking and regulation is an important task and a key element of our economic policy. Let me round off by mentioning a few key challenges that are ahead of us in this area, where I believe that the OECD can contribute. Regulation should give more benefits than costs. This is a simple principle, but not necessarily an easy to live by. In some instances, small but vocal groups may demand a specific kind of regulation that will benefit their group. Often, the costs of these rules may be larger for the society in general than the benefits for the little group. And these issues are at the core of politics. Sound advice from the OECD may contribute to allow us to live up to the principles more clearly. One challenge I hope can be addressed by the OECD is how transforming technologies can contribute to ease the challenges of an aging population, also on public budgets. Another challenge I think all of us face. How should we find the right balance between the need to act quickly and be flexible, and at the same time carefully consider the consequences of the measures that we enact? We value specific advice about regulation of the many intricate and challenging technologies. And I welcome the work of the OECD and the Regulatory Policy Committee in this field over the years to come. And I hope that this conference about the future of lawmaking will give important inputs into our constant effort to make better laws and regulations. Thank you very much for the attention, and I truly hope that you have fruitful and interesting discussions throughout the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. Unfortunately, the Minister has to go because, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, she's got a very busy schedule. But thank you for taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate it. Because the Minister was in a bit of a rush this morning, I didn't have a chance to introduce myself. I think most of you know me, but my name is Janine Richat. I'm the chair of the RPC. I was about to give my work title first, but today I'm the chair of the Regulatory Policy Committee of the OECD, and it's my great honor to be here to kickstart our agenda today. And with that, I'm going to ask Irene Orr, the Deputy Director of the OECD Governance, to come and say a few words before we launch the formal agenda.
Thank you, Janine. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to provide some opening remarks to this 11th edition of the Measuring Regulatory Performance Conference. And the Minister had to leave, but I wanted to express my appreciation to Minister Jensen for her keynote speech and for her support for this initiative, and also to thank the Norwegian Better Regulation Council, Sandra Riese in particular, and the Norwegian Agency for Financial Management, Hilde Singsas, and her staff for jointly co-hosting this conference in such a beautiful setting and fresh atmosphere. Minister Jensen recalled talking about the experience of Norway, in a way, what the work of the OECD on regulatory policy is about, and what are the recipe to have good regulations and good laws. So in these opening remarks, I just would like to add a few insights on, let's say, the RegTech dimension of our discussions today and tomorrow, and how these fit in the broader OECD agenda and countries, and our countries, of course, agenda, in relation to the disruption that new technologies bring to our societies and economies. So the conference, one of the aims of the conference, in addition to brainstorming on how the regulatory policy collective knowledge that we have produced over the years needs to be adjusted or confirmed in view of changes, is the aim is really to improve our understanding on how regulatory policy is affected by digital and other new technologies, but also how governments can improve their regulatory systems to enable these technologies to flourish whilst maintaining social, environmental, and economic outcomes. In fact, this year is an important year for the OECD around this topic of disruptive technologies because, for instance, the OECD Ministerial Council meeting, which took place in May, was precisely focusing on the digital transition, and so how to harness this digital transition for sustainable development, looking at opportunities and challenges. An important focus, as mentioned by the Minister, was about the question of taxation of digital multinationals, but countries also at this occasion called on the OECD to continue provide policy analysis on the digital transition, and the discussions pointed to the importance of regulatory policy in this context and to the need for governments to assess the challenges posed to their rule-making activity. So this conference, in a way, is a direct follow-up to this ministerial mandate. Analysis basically points to 4 broad types of challenges, and I think these will come back in the discussion today through the different presentations. First, a pacing problem. Digital and new technologies tend to advance faster than regulation and social structures governing them. This disconnect, of course, is not new, but there is a growing consensus that digital technologies break new ground in terms of speed. And in fact, it's not only digital technologies that should also be referring to other technologies such as gene editing. Second, challenges to the design of fit-for-purpose regulatory frameworks. The Minister has mentioned it, but yes, we see new business models emerging, and traditional boundaries between sectors, between actors are blurred, and often lawmakers and regulators lack experience in facing these new challenges. Third, challenges to regulatory enforcement. Digitalization in particular challenges regulatory enforcement by questioning the traditional notion of liability. Fourth, the institutional and transboundary challenges. ICTs give businesses global reach while being able to locate various stages of their production processes or services centers across countries. Therefore, international regulatory cooperation is needed to avoid arbitrage. I'm not a seasoned practitioner in terms of regulatory policy, as you can guess, but I suppose it would probably be wrong to say that there is any such thing as business as usual in the regulatory practice. But I think what we're talking about here is really a technological revolution which may affect profoundly the future of state institutions and of lawmaking. So this is why these issues are a very important component of our Regulatory Policy Committee's program, looking at how new technologies are transforming their practice, but also at how trying to help countries to respond to these challenges while making the most of these technologies for society, but also for the functioning of the government. To give you an idea of the context of this conference in terms of our work program, the committee will seek to identify over the next 2 years what needs to be adjusted in existing regulatory policy approaches, looking into the potential development of a typology of relevant regulatory approaches to leverage the opportunities and mitigate the challenges of the digital transformation. We will also work with you to gather good practices on how new technologies can help resource-constrained governments to better regulate. You may have seen already some insights in the 2018 OECD Regulatory Policy Outlook. For instance, the number of OECD countries that now have a requirement for policymakers to include an innovation assessment increased from 22 to 28 between 2014 and 2017. Also, some 70% now of OECD countries use interactive websites to facilitate a live discussion with stakeholders on draft regulations. So our discussions today and tomorrow will contribute to this agenda with an emphasis on the issue of data throughout the entire cycle of regulatory policy. So the design of laws and regulation, their implementation and the compliance question, and their evaluation and review. So it will be also the opportunity to discuss how new sources of data can be used in the regulatory making process, how to factor in data requirements to assess compliance and impact in the regulatory making process, and how data can facilitate enforcement and feed evaluation and review processes. Let me end my short remarks by noting that this conference and the Measuring Regulatory Performance program will also provide useful insights to OECD's work on enhanced access and sharing of data, which brings together several policy communities in view of developing an OECD recommendation on that topic. It's also going to be an very important input to the work we are conducting on the government data strategies and also on how to define criteria for evidence-based policy making and policy evaluation. So all the other colleagues from the OECD Secretariat who are not present here today will also be very interested in the outcome of this collective work. I will stop here. I think opening remarks are always too long, but I look forward to the discussion and thank you again for taking the time to participate and to contribute.
Merci, Irène. Thank you very much for setting out the Governance Directorate's view of how important our work is here and how important what we will be discussing throughout the next 2 days is. I think it's really it's encouraging to us to know that this is such a big part of the Governance Directorate's mission and mandate and the role that we will all play in encouraging that. So with that, before we dive into the first panel, maybe I'll just take a moment to set up what we're going to achieve over the next few days. And before I tell you a little bit more about the agenda, I just want to pick up on some of the themes that we've already heard talked about this morning. When I made the decision that I wanted to put my name forward to become chair of the Regulatory Policy Committee, it was because I am a self-professed regulatory policy nerd. I really do love this stuff. I think it's important work, it's important discussions. But there were two issues in particular that I found so important for us to work on together. One is international regulatory cooperation, and the second was how do we regulate for an era of digital and technological disruption? And so the theme of this particular MRP conference, and it's the third that I attend, the future of lawmaking, it says everything. The future is here. Lawmaking hasn't caught up yet. And so the fact that we're all in this room wanting to work on these issues together, wanting to really roll up our sleeves and figure out how we can make better laws and make better regulations is a really important thing, and it's certainly a cornerstone of the next 2 years of the work that the Regulatory Policy Committee will be undertaking, a very important piece of our program of work. So I think this is a very important conference. The minister gave the OECD a challenge in 3 areas. How do we make sure that when we regulate, the benefits outweigh the costs? How do we maybe use transformative technologies to solve some of the big challenges that our countries face? She used aging population, but we could throw any number of those out there, like climate change. And also, how do we balance between moving quickly in order to allow innovations into our marketplaces versus ensuring that we're protecting the public good? I'm just going to go a tiny step further, and I'm going to launch that challenge back on all of you. As we have the discussions over the next 2 days, remember what the minister has asked the OECD to work on, because we're the ones that work with the OECD on helping figure these things out. And we're the ones that live it on the ground in our respective countries. So I think the minister gave us a really interesting task for the next 2 days. Just really quickly, I'll go very quickly through the agenda just to set up how the next 2 days are going to play out, and then we're going to dive right in, and we're even going to be a few minutes early for the first panel. So that's good chairing right there, eh? Céline and Christiane are looking at me and smiling. I got to keep that roll going. So the first discussion we're going to have, in both the minister and Irene talked about data, and it's really going to be a big theme over the next 2 days. The first panel that will take the stage momentarily is really going to discuss how data is used in regulation, and we're going to discuss administrative and political culture change to allow for the better use of data. We're going to discuss why it's not often available, and we're going to discuss how do we help policy makers and regulators find data, use data, the infrastructure for data. So I think that's going to be a very interesting panel. And I'm not just saying that because I'm sitting on that panel. It's going to be interesting for many other reasons. The second session is going to take a dive into regulatory policy aspects around the ex-ante assessment of regulations and the ex-post reviews. This is, of course, a really important part of our work at the Regulatory Policy Committee, is the tools of regulatory management, and how do we make use of the ex-ante and the ex-post in this new digital world. And we're going to hear from Professor Andrea Renda, who's going to be with us by video, I believe, and then we'll have a panel discussion about some of what we hear in his presentation. This afternoon is where you guys have to do a lot of the work. So there's going to be 3 breakout sessions this afternoon, and you've all picked a breakout session already. The first is going to talk about how do we future-proof the RIA. The RIA is such an important regulatory policy development and management tool. But is it a good enough tool for what we're discussing today? And if it's not, how do we evolve it? Because in the same way that technology is evolving, which means that regulation is evolving, I think we also have to accept that our toolkit also has to evolve. So there's going to be some really interesting discussions around that in the first breakout. The second is going to return to the theme of data. So how do we improve our overall data collection throughout the development of regulations so that you know what data you need to evaluate your regulations, and so you complete the life cycle, keeping data front of mind the entire way through. And then the third breakout session is really how do we regulate in a time of uncertainty? And who do we bring in when we're regulating in a time of uncertainty? Do we have to think differently about collaboration and stakeholder consultation, given that there's new technologies and new innovations coming onto the market from people developed by people that might not have been as involved in regulation in the past? So that's going to be the crux of our day today. I think we should just dive straight into the first panel, but before we do so, I do want to say one more time, thank you to the Norwegian Better Regulation Council and the Norwegian Government Agency for Financial Management, Sandra and Hildy. Thank you for being here with us this morning, and thank you for being such incredible hosts. And with that, I will ask Christiane Arndt-Baskle to please come up, and we'll get the first panel rolling.
Please, huh? We can have the panelists coming up. You will get. Yes. Good. Yeah, just.
Yeah, let us move straight into the panel discussion. We already heard this morning that technologies not only pose challenges, but they actually offer a lot of opportunities. And one of the key findings, and so we hope that they can help us to solve one of the big challenges that we have discussed in previous conferences on measuring regulatory performance, in particular in Lisbon, and I have my colleagues here from Portugal who organized that conference, and in Mexico City as well, where one of the major challenges that was identified to actually know whether laws and regulations are working in practice, which obviously is crucial to know, is that simply data is lacking. There's no good data to know whether laws and regulations actually work, and obviously we need to know that to see whether there are problems that need to be fixed. There are a lot of buzzwords running around the issue of having better data at the moment, moving from machine learning, smart data, big data, artificial intelligence, crowdsourcing data. There's a lot of buzzwords going around, and I hope with the panelists today we can see if any of those make sense, that we can use new technologies for having better data for evaluating laws and regulations. And I'm very pleased that we have very distinguished panelists today, and I will start with introducing panelists from the left. So we have Anita with us. Anita, according to Forbes, is one of the world's top 50 women in tech. She is the founder of IRIS, which is an artificial intelligence tool to connect science research, to read and connect scientific knowledge. This is not her first startup. If I'm well informed, this is her fourth startup, so she likes to try out new things. She also worked in over 9 industries. She has passed by 6 universities, and she built a race car. So I think we'll get some interesting insights from out of the box from Anita. Then I'm very glad to welcome Mart. Mart, he is the director of the statistics, the Director General of Statistics Estonia. He has a career behind him in the private sector, so he can bring insights from that. He has worked in banking and insurance for over 10 years as a CEO, for instance, at Swedbank Estonia asset-based financing. And before that, he has actually has acquired a large experience in leading service organizations in Estonia, including being the CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers in Estonia. Goran, welcome also to the panel discussion. Goran comes from the World Bank, where he leads the business regulation knowledge management and support to client governments in the areas of agile regulation, disruptive technologies, and technology-driven G2B service delivery. Before that, he also has a large experience in different areas. He worked in government as a consultant and in business, and there was a specialization in areas which are really relevant to the discussion today, ranging from digital transformation, artificial intelligence, design and implementation of technology solutions, and information security. And then Janine, she already said that she's the chair of the Regulatory Policy Committee, but obviously that's not the only thing she's doing in life. She is the Executive Director of the Regulatory Policy and Cooperation Directorate at the Treasury Board of Canada. She's making sure that everyone in the Canadian government complies with regulatory policy, so better people don't mess with her. And she already said that she likes international regulatory cooperation, and that's actually the area that she's leading as well in Canada, including coordinating formal regulatory cooperation initiatives like the Canada-US Regulatory Cooperation Council or the Canada-EU Regulatory Cooperation Forum. She has an experience before. She worked in Privy Council office, but she also knows what she imposes on the regulators, as she has a large experience as a regulator in the health sector. Great. So maybe I will directly dive into the panel discussion and ask you, Janine, why do we actually need all of this? So why do we actually care for data? Why do we need data? Can't we do without better data and analysis?
I like that you gave me the first and easiest question, Christiane, for us to talk about today. And I didn't even build a race car, so I really don't know that I can answer this question as well as Anita might be able to. But no, it's, we think about it. We think about this a lot. As Christiane mentioned, in my day job, I'm responsible for regulatory policy, the Canadian government's regulatory policy framework. And if I'm honest, we have not figured out how to incorporate data into that policy framework. And I think it's important to be honest, because that's one of the reasons we're here, is we're trying to figure out how to do this. Intuitively, why it's so important is we know, and I'll go back to what the minister said. I wrote down the very first question she asked. What is the problem that we want to solve? That's the first question we all ask ourselves when we regulate, or we should be asking ourselves when we regulate. And if we want to know that we solved it, then we need a measuring stick against which to compare it. And that measuring stick is data. So if we don't think from the outset, what is the problem I want to solve? And then part B of that question is, and how am I going to measure my success and my impact? Then we're not asking ourselves, we're not doing the right thing as regulators, because we're never going to be able to evaluate our regulatory frameworks and make sure that we're continuing to solve the problem, in my case, for Canadians. So really, when I think about why we need better data, it's precisely because we need to answer that question. Have we solved the problem? And if we haven't solved the problem, that's okay. Now what do we need to do to try to solve it?
Thank you very much, Janine. Goran, maybe you can add on to that. So why is it so hard to get that data?
Actually, it would be strange to hear from someone who is a technology nerd, but actually I'm also working in the regulation space for many years, and I would very much agree with this statement that there is no solution at the moment. At least based on the research and the information that we at the global business regulation of the World Bank have at the moment. And in order to answer this emerging challenge, we designed a new solution area we call technology and business regulation, or RegTech, within the World Bank. And we organized this solution area across three main pillars. The first pillar, and also a roof in this RegTech house, as we call it, is agile regulation. Then we have integrated rulemaking, integrated regulatory delivery, and of course, monitoring and evaluation. And in order to understand how we actually can apply emerging technologies, actually the same technologies that drive business today, we actually did a research this year, mainly within developed countries, in order to understand actually how different technologies, including artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, but also big data, blockchain, IoT, are applied across a regulatory life cycle, from rulemaking over regulatory delivery and monitoring and evaluation. And actually, we identified 50 cases around the world already applying emerging technologies in those segments. And also, we developed six deep dive case studies. One of them is Estonia. We also identified very initial maturity model that we are planning to improve in the future in order to provide to our clients a kind of understanding on how to, let's say, get into certain, let's say, stage or level of development in order to apply and benefit from emerging technologies in rulemaking and regulatory delivery. Also, there are two cases which are of particular relevance for today's discussion and how to, let's say, benefit from data, but maybe we can discuss those cases a bit later.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Anita, do you want to tell us from your perspective, why is it so hard for governments? Why is it easier for business?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. It's not necessarily that hard. That's kind of my in some way my approach to it. Like I don't fully understand. I think the simple answer is that businesses have more flexibility, right? We are more agile. We have the capability to turn around. Like I can sit in a morning meeting going, you know what? This way we're doing things doesn't work. Let's do it differently. And like 10 minutes later, we've started to implement this other thing that we're doing. Mm-hmm. And you know, our governments and our regulatory bodies, as far as from an outsider, it doesn't seem you have that flexibility to go, you know what, this isn't working, let's do this instead, and change that in an instant. And fact is that we are at this point living in a world where you kind of have to. Right, as the finance minister said, you know, suddenly there's these bikes everywhere. What do? Well, let's call them bikes. Bicycles, and you know, maybe that's a solution, maybe not. But fact is, we're living in a world where these things are changing so fast. So there is a need also for regulatory bodies to be able to go, this thing is not working. Let's change it. And of course, that is a hard thing to change, but I think that's the fundamental difference, that we can, you know, I can sit in a meeting and 10 minutes later we've changed our entire data collection strategy, not of the company at large, but like in that thing, that specific use case we're talking about.
Okay, thank you so much, Anita. Maybe Mart, I think in Estonia, we already heard that this is one of the case studies that the World Bank has looked at. Can you talk about maybe give us some practical examples, give us a bit of meat on how you have actually used some modern technologies to better understand how laws and regulations are working in practices, and also tell us a bit what the challenges were that you were facing in that?
I will, but not in the starting. So I would like to be a bit proactive here in a very early. Mm-hmm. First of all, I saw that there is a signed better policies for better lives. We just had a UN conference 2 years ago in New York, which stated better data for better lives. So it seems stolen a bit for the logo on this particular case. And I think we basically aiming a same thing. We're aiming that the better life for the citizens. And now, being very proactive in this term, and in a world of data, we are seeing that, yes, we should have a kind of clear overview where we stand and where we want to go. And are we achieving those goals? Like in a businesses, I mean, are we achieving the market share, or are we achieving a profit, or achieving a subscribers, or whichever? So we like to talk a lot about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So those, the indicator, the core indicator to showing, I mean, are we getting, and are we developing the better world, the better life? Saying this one, I just had 3 weeks ago very interesting discussion with one senior parliament member in Finland. I was showing extensive work what we're doing to kind of visualizing the SDGs. I mean, really bringing the data in a very live format, like Hans Rosling was doing years, showing that what's really happening in society, what are the problems, what we need to tackle, and what we need to tackle with the policies as well, on making the better policies. And the senior guy from the Finnish parliament said to me, I mean, Mart, you are most stupidest guy ever. Because, I mean, do you really believe that the politicians want to see transparency? Do you really believe that they want to see what's going around? They need data only when they have the decision in mind, and they need to kind of data to support their decision, which they have in mind. So that's very early stage to provoke you here a bit. So how we make together? I mean, to combine the data and the policy making based on the full transparency.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually a key issue, which I had later in my questions, but maybe we bring that up immediately. So how can we move? I mean, we all know in some way regulations are experiments, but somehow this is not what the public wants to know. That policymakers don't really know what they're doing. They can't know what they're doing because there are a lot of unknowns when you actually put out a law and you don't really know what's happening. So how do you actually somehow change the culture, not only of policymakers, because in some way the risks they are facing, they're also real, because the population in some way wants that policymakers manage risks, that in a world which has become very messy and where there are a lot of challenges, I think people kind of want to have the person who says, I know what the solution is, and that's the solution, and that's going to work. They don't really want to hear, we're trying out this solution, and if it's not working, we're adjusting it. So how do you move to a culture which accepts this? Jenny, do you want to say something on that?
Sure. I think it's a really important dilemma that a lot of us are facing. And maybe to answer the question, Christine, I'm just going to talk really quickly about something that we're trying. Did I lose my microphone? About something that we're trying in the Canadian context. Our government is really working on, or really putting a lot of efforts into what we call a regulatory modernization agenda. And what is sitting underneath that agenda and what is driving it is this desire for us to ensure that regulation is not stifling Canadian competitiveness, but also to ensure that regulation isn't stifling technological innovation and new ideas coming onto the market. And one of the initiatives that I'm responsible for is designing a new Center for Regulatory Innovation. And the purpose of that center is to be a public-facing center that is going to grow a capacity and an expertise within the Government of Canada to conduct regulatory experiments, so that rather than shutting down a new technology or innovation that arrives on the marketplace because it doesn't fit your regulation, you have opportunities to experiment, to figure out what's going to work, and then hopefully that leads to building more agile regulatory frameworks. Now that all sounds really good, but I can promise you that I will fail if I don't rely on a couple of key principles of better regulation. One of those is openness and transparency. I know for a fact that business is going to be very front and center in this Center for Regulatory Innovation, because they're the ones that drive a lot of these ideas. New technology firms are going to want to come and work with us on new regulatory frameworks. But it's not enough for this center to just work with them. Because if we want Canadian citizens to trust that as we're experimenting, we're keeping them safe, keeping the environment safe, not doing anything to hurt their privacy rights, for example, then we also need to make sure that citizens, consumers, NGOs, that everybody sees a place for themselves in this framework. And so as we're setting it up, that's one of the things that we're doing an awful lot of thinking about is how do we make sure that we don't get captured by just one segment that is driving us to be more competitive and innovative so that their technologies and goods come onto the market, but make sure that we keep the faith of the citizens that we are all regulating in their public interest. So I don't have an answer about how successful we will be yet, but I know that that's top of mind, and gaining their confidence early is very top of mind in how we're setting this up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Janine. One of there were a number of challenges that came out of previous work we had done in conferences on measuring regulatory performance to actually having good data, and that ranged from people in the public sector, not necessarily, I mean, those who are doing the evaluations of laws and regulations who are in charge of it don't necessarily really, are necessarily people who are well acquainted with data. They may not know where the data is, so it might be dispersed. Maybe they're sharing issues across ministries, for instance. So what, Anita, from a business perspective, if that were to be your next startup, advising governments on that, what would you recommend on how to address this issue?
Right. So there's a number of different things, and we probably don't have time to cover them all. But first of all, like the first thing I would, so I want to latch on to the openness and transparency, right? There is no reason why only the regulatory body, the oversight, entity should have the data, right? Obviously, taking privacy concerns into consideration and et cetera. Beyond that, like, this data should be available to everyone. Every citizen that wants to go in and understand what is going on in their country should be able to do so, right? Every nonprofit, every business that wants to leverage that data to build tools for the citizens, for the businesses to understand what's going on, like, everyone should have access to that data, right? That's the starting point, and that transparency in how do we make decisions? What are we trying out? Why are we trying it out? How is our assessment? Like, all of that. Like, obviously, not every citizen is going to go want to dig into all of that data, but it should be there for those who want to. So that's the starting point. And that's kind of, I come from, right now, the company that I'm working on right now, we're all about kind of open science and open data and open access publishing. And so that's very much my world right now. And I think that same thing should apply to governments and to the regulatory environment. So that's the first thing. More importantly, though, talent, right? How, like, if I were to start a startup that is a government or something like that, how do I get the right talent, right? How do you make sure that people who graduate as data scientists, machine learning engineers, computer scientists, first of all, how do you make sure that they want to work with you, or me if I were the startup, and not go do some ad tech company? Because let's face it, Facebook, Google, that's, Amazon, that's where most recent graduates and talent end up. 90% or so of all recent graduates go to the top 4 or 5, internet, smart AI companies. So that's one thing, and so some of them do that, but then some of them go to Cambridge Analytica, right? Which is, how do you make sure that they want to come to you and not Cambridge Analytica? Like, that is a fundamental challenge. And when we speak about talent, it's not just to get, but getting a few programmers and getting a few kind of political science majors. Like, how do you get people that have both a degree in computer science and, political science, right? Like, we have a fundamental problem with our education system because you become siloed still today, right? You get this degree in one thing. Some people, of course, have overlapping degrees, but we're living in a world right now, like, if you want to, even if you had access to all of the data right at your fingertips, how do you go about understanding it, right? And it's not about sprinkling some AI on top of things, because that's not how it works. But, like, how do you go about understanding it? If you have some people understand the data, and some people then understand the political process and the societal process and human beings and philosophy, either you have to have really, really good consortiums or teams working together, but more ideally you would get talent that have both, that understand politics, that understands social sciences of some sort at large, but that also understands computer science. And that means that we have to fundamentally change our education system, which we need to anyway, because it is in many ways very, very broken, without having to go into that in detail. But so that's kind of the education part, which funnels into talent. How do you get the right people to be attracted to working on these issues? And then thirdly, of course, is funding, because you don't necessarily have to hire everyone on a 30-year contract, lifetime employment in the government. Not everyone is interested in that. And how do you attract startups, nonprofits, people with brilliant ideas that are out to make the world better? How do you attract them to work with your data and in your context to understand what's going on? And in that is funding, right? And selling offering services to the government is, I mean, here in Norway there was an example a couple of years ago where had Tesla offered their services to the government, they wouldn't have qualified, right? Because 3-year track record. I don't remember all of the details around it, but there was a lot of fuss about it because they're not a solid enough company to work with the Norwegian government. And I think so getting the right talent through the right education system and revamping that, but also getting the right funding opportunities. And I think kind of one, and let me know if I'm ranting here, but one of the things that I think is really interesting that I think can change some of that is to have sandbox environments, right? Say that the city of, I don't know, Skien, whatever, some city, this is a sandbox environment for autonomous vehicles, or for all citizens of the city will now share their data and they will benefit in the profits of sharing that data. Whatever it is, right? Like all of these, you can have these sandbox environments where you pick one city or one region and you specifically dedicate that to trial and error around a specific new technology or a set of technologies. Because starting at country level or global level, I mean, there's so many layers, there's so much data, there's so much complexity that even for someone who is a data scientist, computer scientist, and social scientist all in ones with a massive team, couldn't possibly make a machine learning or AI model to understand it. Because we're not there yet in terms of technology, so we have to start somewhere. And starting to give more people the ability to play with that data in a more trial and error, trying to understand, trying to build frameworks, trying to build systems, like having that openness, and then all the time being transparent about it so no one can come and say, why are these people digging into our data, right? It has to be transparent.
Thank you so much, Anita. Maybe I pass on to Matt, because you're coming now from the government side. So has Estonia done anything in the area of having better data for evaluating laws and regulations? And if not, is that something that you're planning to do or that you think would be valuable?
Wow, what a broad question. Just, I mean, first of all, I mean, just saying to all of you, I mean, it's basically, it is quite interesting that the statistical offices around the globe, I mean, we are in a position that we have been dealing with the data years, 100 of years, and now we are finally on a stage. So, very frankly, it's very, very fascinating, very nice. But we had an even big conference. We had a big discussion. I mean, what is the difference between statisticians and the data scientists? And we came up that the data science is just the statistics which is done in San Francisco with Apple.
Yep.
So, honestly, I mean, that's and we bring a lot of data together. We're doing it for the policy making a lot, of course. Saying this one, there is, I would say, a couple of angles. First of all, I mean, looking on the statisticians and the kind of indicators what we're producing, we tend to produce with a very, very high quality, and that's one the official statistics represents, a high quality on indicators. On the same time, we want to get very quickly a very kind of insight for particular data sets. And we call it experimental statistics. So why we're calling it, it does not apply with all the same statistical rules what have been set on our code of practice in this term. So, and we do such kind of insights, but you always need to take into account that if the new data is appearing, the results may be a different ones. So therefore, yes, we have digged in this one. And what we do currently is we are producing for the different ministries, for the different relevant bodies, the insights, and we say that it's experimental statistics in this terms. It's based on the data which is available just now. But what we do is we do it on a mostly we try to do it on a based on the real-time data. So what does it mean? We use really it's not real time in this term that we having a full connection with the mobile data and the electricity data, which, by the way, is true as well. So we use electricity data, for example, to kind of finding out, for example, what are the dwellings, what are empty on the rural areas, what are the policy, what can be applied to really supporting the rural areas in these terms, etc. So that's based already on a big data, we can say. But on the same time, I mean, we say that, yes, I mean, due to the fact that it's maybe not a fully comprehensive and we don't have a long time history on some of the data sets, it may change over the time, so you need to evaluate in a many times. Saying this one, by the way, what is the essential on this one? So we have been in the statistics and also the policy making mostly on a deductive mode, I would say. We have something in mind, we try to test the question what we have in mind and seeing what are the patterns on this one. But we can look on an inductive mode as well, which is, by the way, that seeking the data itself and seeing what patterns coming out from the data. And showing this one, we have just one example. We tried with both modes. We had two different teams in our organization trying to find out what are the reasons why the childs are born in Estonia. So what we took a data from the parents 12 months before the child was born. And we seek the patterns. So what is the change of the income? Is the change of the education? The change of the living place? Or the change of the working place? Or what are the patterns? What really puts into the mind of the people, of the parents, that they want to have a child now? But a very interesting study.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, to the statistician office? Because one of the, and I'm sure you are already thinking about this and planning it. I'm curious as to how far this has come along, which is data that goes beyond numbers. I mean, all data is numbers, but text, understanding language, right? And I was just like, this is a very, very anecdotal evidence, but like, so I run a company that is operating out of one country, but we have employees in 10 different EU countries, right? And when we hired the first one, he was living in Denmark, and it was a Norwegian company, and he was going to move to Finland. You know, it was one of those things. And I pick up the phone and I call, you know, the local tax office, I guess, in Norway, and go, hey, how do I hire this person? A conversation goes something like, well, is he going to move to Norway? No. Well, is he going to work in Norway? No. Then we don't know, right? And there was this conversation where, like, I don't know if there is regulation. I don't know what the regulation is, and neither did the office, right? There was, and so we winged it, and we did hopefully the right thing, and he does, you know, he did pay his taxes, you know, not in Norway, and it was one of those things where that recording, like that's one data point, right? But I have a lot of friends that run similar companies that have similar data points. Those recordings, those voice conversations, I mean, that's data too, right? And those kinds of data, especially when it comes to regulatory bodies, like all of those discussions, all of the questions, all of that data is, you know, in some instances, for some regulations, way more important than, you know, the easier to measure numbers, right?
Yeah, what we can say from Sony, just an example, we use the satellite data. And that's basically the same. I mean, it's a picture data, but you can take it, I mean, from the audio record as well. So we use the satellite data. And for what we're using, it's not for a stat office in these terms, but we have been in developing a particular algorithms or supporting the developing algorithms. It's for the official governmental support for the agricultural area, the rural areas, for cutting a grass. And cutting a grass for, I mean, you need to cut the grass for some supports, I mean, I think it was once in 2 weeks. And I mean, nobody can, I mean, go and to the site visits and see this one, so it's unbelievable. So now we use satellite data. So we extract from the satellite data what are the areas which is the grass is cutted and when it's cutted, and we use this one. And also based on this one we can, I mean, provide also the different other, I mean, information out of this one.
Thank you. Goran, you talked before about the case studies. Can you provide us with some very concrete examples on
Yes.
how the use of more modern technologies has helped to better understand the impact of laws and regulations?
Yes, actually, I can, and also to connect to what Anita mentioned, that many of those jurisdictions that we interviewed applied those AI augmented chats or chatbots. So it's very important to capture when AI didn't know on certain problem and to inform the AI so to know in the next iteration. So that's the great benefit from the technology. Of course, it always operates with a human expert in the loop, but it can significantly help to learn from data generated on a daily basis. Let me be kind of specific regarding the cases, and also to connect to what actually we heard from the minister this morning, is the regulation of the sharing economy. So that question was faced by the government of Queensland in Australia, and in order to, let's say, involve different experts from different domains to search for a solution, they've used crowdsourcing. So they've used MindHive to reach out to different experts to, let's say, stimulate them and facilitate discussion regarding possible ideas on how to regulate the sharing economy, in that case Uber or the transportation industry. And they actually are now in the phase of implementation of this, let's say, those regulatory changes in order to, let's say, find the interplay between the technology and new digitally enabled business models and traditional operators. So that's one example of the use of crowdsourcing actually to regulate the new digital enabled business models and this multi-sided digital platforms. Another interesting example is from the US and Canada to use actually a tool called Reg Data for regulatory stock scan. So unfortunately, regulators are not only regulating, but also, I would say, are creating a problem for themselves. Because at certain moment, you have a huge number of different administrative requirements which are actually not codified. And it's very difficult to use certain technology in order to, let's say, inform decision makers and policy makers on certain relevant regulation pieces when it comes to changes. So Reg Data actually uses machine learning, first natural language processing and text analytics, and machine learning in order to structure administrative requirements, to identify relevance of those requirements to different sectors, and inform regulators on relevant requirements which are needed to be amended in order to, let's say, introduce certain innovation. But the question is how to, and that was also discussed before, I think also mentioned by Anita, how to change the mindset of regulators. So for instance, we now introduced certain models from software development into rulemaking and regulatory delivery, such as agile and sandboxes, and those concepts are used for years in software development. So how to make now regulators to use those concepts of agile, to make regulation more agile from one hand, but also to have, let's say, enough certainty to protect public interest and public good. How to use sandboxing approach, for example, to make certain innovation in a limited environment at the level of certain city, and then test and experiment to see what would be the best approach to select. That is a challenge that I think we have to consider how to, let's say, cope with, and to actually try to see how we can influence that mindset shift. We are thinking on forming, I would say, an international or global virtual agile regulation laboratory in order to connect regulators using now technology in order to see how we can actually systematically approach to knowledge development of regulators in order to understand how to actually create new regulatory models that are needed in order to apply technology to regulate more agile and allow innovations while safeguarding public interest. And I would say that that can take some time, and it should be done systematically.
Thank you.
One of the themes that comes up as well is that in some way the traditional regulatory management policy was that you pass a law and then after 5-10 years you evaluate whether it's working in practice. While nowadays you can imagine that you can do some more real-time tracking of impacts of laws and regulations, so in some way move to more continuous evaluation. So Janine, I would be interested in knowing if you think that's something worthwhile pursuing. Is that something, would that be your vision of how laws and regulations are evaluated in the future? And if yes, what would be your questions to the other panelists to make that happen?
Ooh.
Can they provide some advice to Canada in that respect?
Well, a question would be, who wants to come and help me figure it out? Canada's lovely this time of, well, actually it's not lovely this time of year. We're having some bad weather there in the spring, but I think we don't have a choice. We have to figure out how to, you asked, Christiane, is it worthwhile? We don't have a choice. If anybody in this room thinks it's not worthwhile for us to have this discussion about how to evolve regulatory management tools, I think you might unfortunately be in the wrong room, because the time has passed where we can look at and regulate for a point in time and a snapshot in time. When I think of what my wish list is to make that happen, so I spoke about the center that we're setting up, the Center for Regulatory Innovation, which is meant to help us figure out, sandboxes have been raised. We plan to have some sandboxes, some regulatory sandboxes that are run out of that center, some pilot projects around things like co-developing not only regulation, but co-developing product labels, for example, so that you don't have product labels that look different in Canada and the US and the EU, but you work together in partnership to figure out what needs to be on this package so that all consumers understand what they're using, buying, consuming, etc. So definitely the center is going to help us figure out some of that. And from the experiments that we run, we hope that we also figure out what are some principles to design agile and flexible regulation versus a point in time. I think I need two main things to get that done. One is I need to give, and when I say I mean the system, needs to give regulators permission to be more outside the box. I'm in a central oversight body now, but as Christiane mentioned, I was a regulator, and I don't mind admitting that when I was a regulator, here was my box, and I crawled as tightly as I could inside of that box, because I was so worried that if I moved outside of that box, somebody would get hurt, something bad would happen. My regulation would be, it would be some kind of regulatory catastrophe, and it would be all my fault because I moved out of the box. If regulatory oversight bodies really want to help regulators change, then regulatory oversight bodies have to give them permission to move out of that box. And that means changing culture, that means changing the rules, that means giving them the ability to say, okay, I'm going to do things a little bit differently, and that big bad Treasury board isn't going to come and tell me I'm doing it wrong. They're going to support me as I try something new. So that's number one. The second thing that we need is, if you're going to try something new, and that's the theme of this panel, you need to track how you're doing and whether or not it's working. And so on my wish list is some kind of better way for us to collect, analyze, and use data. And I think Canada has a pretty good regulatory policy framework, but when I think of the one big piece of the puzzle that's missing, it's that infrastructure. It's the data infrastructure. Because it's not data that doesn't exist, it exists everywhere. But when I was a regulator, my information management system to regulate natural and non-prescription health products was literally being held together with like duct tape and chewing gum. It was old technology. It fell apart all the time. It crashed all the time. It couldn't be trusted to collect the data I needed. If we can't find a way to support regulators through the infrastructure that they need to collect, analyze, and use data, then giving them permission to experiment won't go very far. So if I was going to ask the panelists any one question, it would be, what can we do to build better data infrastructure in regulatory agencies? And would you like to come and do it for me?
Great. So I would start from the left, and
Right. So I think this comes back to what I mentioned initially, which is how do you work with providers of those tools? Do not build it yourself, right? I mean, that's a big undertaking. So like get someone to do it. And I think to do that, you cannot just work with the big software consultancy houses that charges you $1 million up front and then delivers nothing at the end of the period. Like you have to be more courageous in working, not necessarily with very early stage startups, because a lot of them are going to fail and it's going to be a big risk, but maybe work with, taking the chance of working with multiple smaller providers to do evaluations, et cetera. And you might have to have for the countries that have very strict tender processes, you might have to like bypass that and find other ways to work with that. Whether that requires a full regulatory change in itself, I don't know. But try more trial and error on that front too, to see what is possible. Because fact is that in that context, you are going to be working with technology that some of it is going to be on the forefront. And if you are waiting for a consultant to build that over, a considerable period of time, you're just not going to get. You're going to get the old stuff that isn't giving you what you want. And I think also one thought around the question you asked that, initially is this idea. Okay, so we've had the kind of okay, we implemented this framework, and then we can see, a year, 10 years later, we can look at the data and say, okay, how did that go? Then it's the real-time things that we're talking about now, right? How can we keep track of what anyone is saying on social media or in, whatever public written content is out there, blogs, et cetera, where people talk about these things? What is public sentiment? What is, how, can we look at satellite data to see how it literally affects the physical world around us? Because that's where things are happening, not in the telephone, Norsk Gallup calling you to ask about something, months after the fact, the real time. But then is the next challenge, right? How do you set those systems up so that you can start making predictions, right? And if you can build the systems, the real-time systems right now in the right way, 5 to 10, maybe even 15 years from now, we can start building predictive models. So you don't actually have to try out the new regulatory framework in practice. You can go, what if we were to do it like this? What would the outcome be? And we are not at the point where that is possible, technology-wise, but we will be, right? Give it 10, 15 years, and we will be. Give it shorter time for little tiny systems, right? But for a full, national or global, obviously we're further into the future. But we can, eventually we're going to be able to build those systems where we can do predictive models. And at that point, you want the infrastructure and, to have all the data collected already so you could do the predictions. And you want providers that think that far ahead, and very old, very kind of stale software providers aren't going to be that company.
Thank you. Matt, do you want to add on to that?
Yes, just for me there is always two parts. One is really the infrastructure, and I think the question was now about the infrastructure. The other part is, of course, about the analytic skills. But let's tackle with the infrastructure. I mean, when we Estonia is known as a solid e-state, and why it's solid e-state, we started really years ago with no legacy, and that's what really benefit for us. If you have no legacy, it's very easy to start. And that was two things which was right in a very early stage, and we are really lucky to say this one. The first one, we introduced base registers. In these terms, that we have the identifier codes, and if you think to how you interlink the data, you need the objects and you need a code for the objects to link the data. That was one. And the second one, we built up the so-called Estonian X road, which is an interoperability framework. how you can get the data from organization to another. And I think those ones is now where we can easily say that yes, the Estonian e-governance 1.0 has done, so we are building now the 2.0, which is precisely what we're doing. Is we are talking about how to make from this data really there's something which is benefit for the citizens and for the entrepreneurs. I will show it later on afternoon, but that's really the core. So how to put the interoperability framework and how you put not the base registers itself, but how you put a really understandable regulation. Something is missing.
I think there's a mic coming.
Yep.
Oh,
Oh,
there it is.
no.
That's back.
Thanks. I will try to say that the other thing I think what is very important is, and if it's possible to do, to set up a really rules how you define the data in a public sector. And saying this one, what does it mean? I mean, it's always a question for all the policymakers, and it's not only policymakers, it's for everyone, where the data is, how I can find where the data is. And that is very good examples, by the way, across the globe. Good examples from Finland with the Yhteen Tekevä Suomi, with the Canada, with the New Zealand, the leading data countries. I mean, we all have been tackling with this one, that we need a very clear definition how the data is defined in informational systems, how the interoperability is secured, so you can find this metadata, so-called, so the definition about the data. And we also add one kind of point on top of this one, in particular it's done in Canada and in New Zealand. We said that in every public organization we need a data stewards. Data steward, somebody who understands what data we have, who makes it accessible, and also is in European Union, for example, somebody who supports the GDPR officer, saying that yes, I mean this is the private health data. That's the data we have in general. So so that's very important to establish a data stewardships also. It's not the person, it's a more role kind of in organization. And it's not in IT department, guys. Mm-hmm. It's just somebody from the business side who defines what the data means.
And do you talk to each other? I mean, one of the big challenges which often comes up when we talk to the different communities, Irene mentioned this morning that we have a number of colleagues also working on the issue of data. We're working on a data strategy. Colleagues are working on that in government, for instance, is that sometimes you have evaluation units even in government, but those people who are in charge of evaluating laws and regulations are not necessarily, or those who are doing impact assessments are not necessarily talking to the people in the evaluation units, for instance, or not necessarily talking to statistical offices. So sometimes data is there, but people are not aware of it. Are you actually talking to people who are making laws and have to see if they're working in practice to find out what their needs are, but also to inform them about what data is available?
Yeah, I mean Estonia is really, therefore I mean we are like this town you mentioned. I mean we are the testing town, so-called. So we are very, I mean with the very small population, it's very easy. I mean we just call to each other and we meet and we talk extensively with the IT guys. Of course, the CIO of the Estonia, we are talking, I mean, on a weekly basis, really, discussing, I mean, how the infrastructure and data and everything should be put in place. But with the policymakers also, we have said that, yes, if we do whichever a new development plan in Estonia, and that's linked with the policymaking as well. So if we develop any new kind of strategical plan, the data office is always included in the discussions. And I think it's very important. And sometimes we are also mediators in terms of between different silos, because I mean, even in a small town, you can have a silos, I mean, between the ministries. I mean, I don't know, I don't really understand why they don't talk to each other, because I mean, they have the data. I mean, for example, Ministry of Social Affairs have the data, and the Ministry of Economics wants the data. So just guys, I mean, they need to be kind of talking to each other more. But nevertheless, I mean, we're happy to intermediate on this one. and support this one. That's what we're doing, yes.
Thank you. Goran, do you want to add anything to the
I would
two
like
discussions
to
we had?
introduce more disruption into this discussion by saying, what about the private data? Actually, because also I worked for the government and for the government inspectorate for 7 years. I'm technology specialist, but also at the same time inspector. And actually, at that time, and it was 15 years ago, we were thinking on how to make government registries interoperable and how to make government-owned data accessible by inspectors. Today, that actually shifted, and we have a new situation. A new paradigm is needed because the private sector now owns more data and has more data than the public sector. And the question is how public sector now can benefit from data owned by the private sector, by those multi-sided platforms. Facebook actually knows today more than we know about ourselves. So how to, let's say, leverage that data and how to make, let's say, certain standards to, let's say, make those data accessible to regulators. We discussed with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology their internet policy initiative, how to, let's say, make those principles, which are also, let's say, complementing overall agile regulation principles, on how to, let's say, define certain standards to make summary data, depersonalized data from the private sector accessible by regulators. And by doing that, and we've already identified some examples, which I mentioned later, then regulators are more agile and can perform their activities more seamless with less burden to private sector. So private sector directly benefits from less burden by sharing the data with the public sector. And another case out of those 50 that we identified is now in the US, and regulators in Nevada are using Twitter to inform risk assessment for planning of food inspections. So they are using tweets, and for example, if certain tweets are kind of concentrated close to certain restaurant and related to certain potential food disease or food poisoning, those tweets automatically are used by the machine learning combined with other indicators to inform risk assessment and inspection targeting. So that's another example of using private sector data to inform regulatory delivery in this case. So we already have those examples which are emerging around the globe. And what is needed, I think, is to have technology specialists become more regulators and regulators become more technology specialists in order to understand, let's say, what technology can deliver and also what regulation actually has to cover in order to develop a proper regulatory models which are then supported with the technology to be applied in practice.
Thank you, Goran. Before I move into questions from the audience, maybe I will do a last tour de table because there's certainly some burning points maybe that I haven't asked the right questions that you may want to make sure that you can share with the audience. So I'll start with Anita.
No, I want to leverage what Goran said because I think you're so spot on, right? Because there needs to be a collaboration because, yeah, the private sector has way more details than any government body, like at this point. I think there is a public opinion challenge that is very much, needed to be tackled, which is that when, I think, and this is just my gut feeling and perception, so take it with a pinch of salt, but I think, public opinion when it comes to government, fetching data from private organizations, we immediately think CIA or FBI going in and prying in people's personal lives to catch them for doing something bad. That's where your mind goes to, which is not the case, right? In terms of the Twitter example, which is brilliant. And so I think there is a very strong kind of public opinion piece there, like how do we go about making sure that those collaborations are transparent, so that citizens and the public know exactly what data the governments are fetching from our Facebook profiles or Twitter profiles or whatever it is, so that it's very clear and transparent, what that data is and why it's being shared. Because I think that's. Do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. I have to take the floor because it's very important. Actually, that leads to the question: who owns the data?
Exactly.
So, if I own if I own data which I provided to the platforms, for example, if I order Uber and if I'm driving with Uber, actually I'm the owner of the data. Data is generated by the platform, by those sensors, GPS, etc. But actually, I am the one who owns the data. If I provide a consent that data can be shared with regulators, then it's quite clear situation.
Yep.
So if I want that, and if I confirm that actually I accept to share my data with regulators, then Uber should, or any other platform, should provide those data to regulators, maybe depersonalized to actually protect privacy regulation and standards. But the government then can benefit from the data. Another interesting question, and we don't know the answer, actually is who owns the predictions? Because predictions are generated by AI algorithms. AI still doesn't have personality, so AI cannot be an owner. And actually those predictions and algorithms are usually built on certain data sources owned by third parties. So the question is, who owns the algorithm, and also who owns the data generated by those algorithms, which are those predictions? So data ownership is one of crucial topics to be solved when it comes to data access.
Which I want to tie into universal basic income, which is the logical next step to discuss in that, which is I am of the belief that each citizen, each human being should own their own data, and whenever that data is leveraged by a company, by a government, by some other individual, they should get paid for the usage of that data. And with that, you don't have to figure out universal basic income for everyone, because everyone owns their data and is being paid for that. Add on top of that, when we talk about impact and sustainable development goals, add on top of that, because obviously not all data is equal at this point, and not everyone's data is worth the same. That is a fact of life. But if we just say for a moment that it is, we could build really, really interesting kind of universal sharing economies where everyone contributes with their data and gets money in return. The technology, again, is not there yet to manage this entire system, but it is coming, right? And blockchain may or may not be one of those kind of sharing micro-transaction economies that, may or may not be a technical solution, a little too energy inefficient at this point, but, technology is coming that will allow us to build systems like that, where we can, give specific permission to share our data and get rewarded for it. And I think that is, it is a fundamental question that we need to solve.
And maybe just to add to that we have a number of colleagues also working on that concept on how you can share data. I think you mentioned very important how you can anonymize the data. They're working on that, what solutions there are, but also what might be the limits to, because in some cases also technology is able to de-anonymize data. So we have colleagues actually, and there's one of the papers I think which is out there, which is exactly on that topic and which might be helpful in that discussion.
And if you have enough data, it's never going to be anonymous. Right? I mean, if you can track data to one person, I mean, it's...
Another question is, what is anonymous today?
Yep.
Yeah. Could I now a bit give you a feedback with the data and the data ownership? Just giving you an example, it's not so simple. Because
no, of course.
Owning a data, and particularly if you say that I own my health data. Now, saying this one, it's important to understand that we cannot develop a new medicine. We cannot develop new procurement if we don't have a personalized data from the persons. And if the persons are saying that I don't give my data, it's not benefit for the society anymore. So that is, for us, there is a different meanings. I mean, what we need to talk is, of course, we need to talk who is the owner of data, but we need to talk about the ethics of using the data. Saying this one, I will say also that more data is not the better data. Because quite many times the different organizations are coming to us and saying, I mean, do you have the mobile data? We need something, statistics out from the mobile data. We are asking, for what purpose you need? For what is the purpose? And they are saying, I mean, we need to understand where the people are living and for example, where they are going to the schools or they are going for working place, etc. So you don't need mobile data, honestly. In most of cases, we don't need a huge amount of data. We don't need a granulated big data. We need to understand for what purposes we need the data, and that is a data available in most of cases to give the answers. Of course, you can add something with a particular data sets. We try to find out for the policy making particularly where you need a personalized data, and honestly, in most of cases, there is no need for a personalized data. It's enough that it's a micro-aggregated data, or pseudonyms data, or aggregated data, so you don't need a personalized data. So it's absolutely, it's in particular small fields where it's only the question. And ending this one is, we're saying that yes, we need to talk with the many aspects of keeping the data, and that is the aspect which is, we talk the rights of data owner, or the who is a data owner. We need to talk about ethics, but we need also talk about privacy. We need to talk about confidentiality, and we need also to talk about the security. There are all the different things, and we need to tackle with all those things.
I think it's very interesting what you're raising, and I think in some cases it's also important not to forget kind of the basics, because sometimes you may not need the data of everyone, as you were saying, but sometimes maybe you just need a statistically representative sample, and you don't need to know everything about everyone to make a policy decision.
Saying this one, of course, we are in a most favorite position. This across the globe in most of the cases, and the statistic legislation allows us to get a privately held data on a granular level with all the kind of aspects with this one. But the statistical offices are dead ends in these terms, that we are securing a better way the data than the Google or Facebook are doing, by the way. Nobody is not believing us. I don't know why. I mean, why we don't believe the state, and particularly we have the highest level than the security above the data than any company have. That's very important aspect. So we keep, and we don't give a data. We don't give out data. Nobody granulated data. None to any regulator, or none to any tax office or administrative body as well. So that's very important to understand as well.
And you want to just quickly react? Okay, you can anytime, and then we move to the...
I wanted to make a comment on the health data and sharing of health data, because, and you know this already, of course, but the tech platforms, so Facebook and Google and all, I mean, I am paying for Google with my data, right? I am paying for Facebook with my data. I should pay for my healthcare with my data as well. I mean, I think that is fairly easily solved. You know, if you want to use the health services, you have to give up your data. And you know, citizens are used to that kind of trade at this point. We're questioning it, but then, you know, look. I mean, if you look at consumer services, and if you look at the rate of which people are willing to give up their privacy and their data and their rights just to click that, you know, yes, I agree to the terms of service. I mean, how many people here read terms of service on any app they download, right? We don't. We just give it up. And consumers, that's a sometimes sad fact of life, that we are just willing to go along with it. And I think, you know, applying that business mindset or that business model, let's call it that, also on things like if we were to give citizens ownership of their data, well, if you want to then use the country's healthcare service, you are obliged to accept the terms of service, which includes giving up your data.
Well, I think that probably would have quite a controversial debate about it, but I don't make it all about privacy. I mean, because I'm not sure how much choice the citizens would then have in that case, which I think probably is still important to give citizens choice in that. Do we want to move on, Goran, Janine, to
I
do you have any final points?
I'm happy to
Any
go to
final points,
questions.
Goran?
Yeah, actually, I have one. Usually in the private sector, and I was also in the private sector before I started working for the World Bank, all is about how to survive the day. It's about the cash flow. It's about the data as a fuel. But actually now with the data which has to support this new agile regulation paradigm, I think that we have to shift to the next level. That next level we internally discussed, and this is, I would say, the second public disclosure after last week's conference in Tallinn on business registries, is data as a public good. So how to make data more public goods for both citizens, businesses, and also public administration.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions from the audience? We have a bit of time now still left. Are there any questions? Up there, I already see Morten raising his hand. And then Nick.
Thank you. My name is Morten. I'm coming from the Danish Business Authority. First of all, thank you for a very interesting panel discussion. Especially, I found the question on why it's easier for business to apply data and to be more flexible very interesting. And I guess that one of the answers to that question is also that governments and regulators must more profoundly consider they are working to provide profit.
Do you mind standing up?
Yeah,
Then
sorry.
it might be easier to see.
That they are working to provide profit for citizens of entire nations, other than just shareholders or an individual owner of a corporation. And that also requires that data collection is, of course, lawful, and that collection of data must, in some instances, first be lawfully, or the right to collect data must first be lawfully established before the data collection can begin. So what are your thoughts on overcoming this rigidness, if you say so, in the light of collecting and using data?
Thank you. Are there any panelists you want to specifically address the question to?
Well, given that we are here, it's from a government perspective. So maybe some being in a silo, some of those already having experience from government and being a regulator could answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mark. Nick. Mm-hmm. And if there are any other questions, please already raise your hand so that I can put you on the list.
Yeah, Nick Malishep from the OECD Secretariat. I'd also like to thank the panel for a fascinating discussion on kind of good regulatory practice, or good practice on using administrative data. But I wanted to pick up on a point that Mart made initially, which I think is really critical. And it was kind of this regulate first and then find the data to support the regulation. And we certainly find a lot of practice across the OECD when looking at regulatory management tools where oftentimes the impact assessment is a bit of a backfill. I mean, it's very much this policy-based evidence. And maybe this is more for all of the panel, but certainly for the two people from government in terms of how, if there is this good data out there, or if you're striving to create this good data, how do you change the mindset of policymakers to really move towards that much more inductive approach, which you think would really lead to better outcomes?
Mm-hmm. The gentleman over there. Okay.
Hi. Hi, I'm Niels Björksen. I'm from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board in the European Commission. I also want to thank the panel for a very interesting discussion. I wanted to lift another thing on the table, just as a practical matter, working with legislation. There's a mix between primary legislation, what gets put in statute, and secondary legislation, what agencies do as implementing acts. And I wonder if what you're talking about would imply a bit of a change in what that mix would look like. Rule changes are always really costly because they upset plans for the future, they require learning the new rules, so you don't want to have rapid rule changes all the time, especially in primary legislation. And it's hard to get changes in primary legislation because it's hard to collect the votes for something that's going to be done. So for this reason, there's a lot of procedural hurdles to these changes. And the procedural hurdles are a bit lower in secondary in implementing legislation, but they're still there, and there's good reasons for it. So I was wondering if what you're discussing, the problems you're discussing, if they imply a move towards more investment in agency capacities and requiring agencies to do more on gathering and analyzing and reporting these data, if that's the area to focus on rather than on what's happening at the top level.
Thank you. There's a question here as well. Lady from and then there, and then we're closing the questions from the public.
My name is Siri Pettersen Strandenes from the Norwegian Better Regulation Council. And I was interested in the statement that data is and should be public goods. And for most data, I agree. But for some business data, this raises really competition problems. And I have one example. We have in Norway very little competition or very few major food stores, 3 big groups. So they were asked and had to publish the price changes in a public website so that people could know who was the cheapest, and that should encourage and reduce their market power. But of course, the other competitors looked at the same prices. So the effect was that you had gained nothing by reducing the price because your competitor would reduce them at the same time. So in this way, making those data public really reduced competition. So I would like to have some comments on that.
Thank you. And Yilmaz? And then we're going back to the panelists.
My name is Yilmaz Arguden. I'm from business at OECD. The recent research about startups, which covered over 400,000 startups, indicated that the ones who are successful are not necessarily ones who have the best knowledge or the best scientists or whatever, but those who can test their products faster. So, and also with data, one could really learn the speed of adaptation or speed of ability to influence behavior through regulation. Could we utilize data to test regulations in small areas to see which one works better, and it would really help impact analysis, and also before major negative externalities appear, one could test different policies and different regulations to make sure that it works better. Could this kind of a utilization be possible? And has anyone tested these?
Thank you. Then let me go back to the panelists. We have a few minutes left. If you can just all quickly answer the questions that you think are most relevant for you, and then we will wrap up. Huh? Anita,
Who start in the other end?
Okay, we can answer. Janine, that's fine.
I see. I was going to use the time to think of answers, but no. I want to start with the first question. And I think you raised a really important point that governments have a different set of shareholders than businesses do. So for us to realistically think that governments can ever act in the same way as business, I certainly don't believe that that's possible. Not that we shouldn't aim to move the yardsticks to becoming more agile and to becoming more iterative and to adopt some of the philosophies and practices. But I think we have to also admit that we're not business. We are government. And some governments, more than others, suffer from lack of confidence that citizens have in them. And so does business. In some cases, big tech, like look, Facebook is being called before Parliament and Congress and everything else because consumers have also lost faith in the ability of big tech companies, big platforms to protect them. So it's a really, really interesting question, and I don't know the answer other than to say that I don't think we should try to be like business. We need to be better government. And so we need to look at who are the people that we can work with, learn from, collaborate with, and come up with the model that keeps, in my case, Canadians having confidence in us as regulatory bodies. But we're not business, and that's okay. Sorry, I know I'm having some trouble with my mic. Do you want me to use that one? Thank you very much. Sorry about that, cutting in and out. The other question that I wanted to touch on really quickly was Nick's, how to change, how to sort of change the mindset of regulators. I'll go back to something I said earlier. We have to give them permission. Many of us in this room are oversight bodies. We have to give them permission to try new things and experiment. I don't know how this is going to work, but one of the things that the Canadian government has tried is it's asked every department to set aside, not just in the regulatory sphere, but in all spheres of policymaking, set aside 10% of their budgets for experiments. And by experiments, I don't mean the big scary things that would have people really worried that we're going to, as regulators, make them unsafe, but little tiny iterative experiments that you can try at Health Canada, at Transport Canada, to change the way you deliver services. Don't have enough evidence yet to see if that's working, but the fact that we're giving permission is a huge culture change. So we'll kind of monitor that and see how it goes. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was Nil's question about agencies and giving them giving more power there, or more capacity there, I think was the word you used. Yes. 100%. It's not me who needs the capacity as an oversight body. It's the regulatory departments that need the capacity to work with data, collaborate with external stakeholders, and all of the good things we've been talking about here. I really think that has to happen at the agency level. And then I think the other questions, there's experts far more educated than me who can speak to those.
Thank you so much, Janine. I move directly to Anita because she is on her run to Stockholm, where she has another conference.
And the reason why I wanted to because I had an answer and I forgot entirely which question it was to, so I had to just wrap my head around what was I saying again. No, it was because most of the questions were directed at the regulators. So, but the one thing, and I can't remember now the phrasing of the question, but it was around how to give regulators and all these committees and organizations more freedom and how to change the way we're working. And I do think that is, someone who has been in the regulatory environment for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. I don't think that's where you're going to find the people who can structure the organizations of the future. Don't bring just startup kids in either, please. Do not do it that way, right? But bring in interdisciplinary teams with a variety of background that has experience from, agile, Scrum, waterfall, whatever it is, right? But that has that experience, that is used to working in different ways, but that also understands, as the point was being made, Facebook has done a lot of, Facebook has this move fast and break things, right? That's their thing. They've broken a lot of things. They've broken a lot more things than they intended to break. And you really, we don't want Facebook to keep doing that either, and we definitely don't want kind of entire countries to do that. So, keep the somewhat conservative, approach to it, but yet bring in people with different mindsets and different work skills and have, a merger of the two. And I don't think every, government should work as a startup company, because we would all radically fail, because 97% of startups fail. Don't do it that way, but bring in kind of an in-between point of view.
Thank you so much, Anita. Matt, please.
Very quickly, I want to address all the 4 questions. Just first of all, once only principle, about data collection. I will elaborate it on afternoon a bit further. I mean, how we have in a law a statement, once only principle on a data collection and how it fits together that we need the data. The second one, which comes to the public code, which, yes, I mean, we need to understand, we need to keep a confidentiality, and that's why I'm stressing the privacy is not enough. The confidentiality is also important. On the same thing, showing you a good example with the sharing of data was from Canada, when they introduced in a price collection the cannabis price. So they started to collect the cannabis price before it was officially allowed to use the cannabis in Canada. And that's affect also positively that the market was dropping and equalizing across the Canada. So just one nice example from the Canada. Which comes to the really bringing a very interesting or a way of working in a public sector. What we do in Estonia, we use a lot of hackathons. We like to use hackathons, also on a public sector. So what we tend to do now, and we're seeking in a law also change a law so that you don't need, or if you do the public procurement, you can take directly from the hackathon the winning prize to your kind of service provider. And that's something, I mean, you need to catch up with the private sector, I mean, how we can do with the new ways, things. And the last thing, the mindset thing, that's personally, that's my favorite question. I mean, how we change the mindset. And particularly if you see the development plans, and you see that in most of the countries, the development plans having the same indicators across the century almost. I mean, the same indicators coming from the one development plan to another one and another one. And we tend to have a long history on those ones. And we don't see what is really the broadening the view and what's really happened in a society. Should we put a new target, a new indicator to think about it? And saying this one, I think we need to start, once again, asking more questions, why? And particularly from the ministry as well, as Norway has said it, what is the problem we are solving? Mm-hmm. And is it really the important problem and the urgent problem we are solving? We need to start, once again, questioning why. Mm-hmm. And honestly, believe me, there is a lot of people who can come up with the data to support the answers and finding the solutions.
Mm. I'm going to sneak out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you. Goran, some final remarks. I actually realized that you're the perfect talent that Anita has mentioned, that you both have as you said yourself, you're both a technology nerd and at the same time you have a lot of experience in government. So
yes, technology and regulatory nerd. Okay, because I see all zeros here and we don't have much time, so let me comment the competition angle and how to implement those more agile principles. So when it comes to the competition angle and public good, I would say that's very much connected to data ownership. So if certain multi-sided platform is having certain advantage from certain data, then it's a question of ownership of data. So that has to be resolved as well. When it comes to how to be more agile, that's very difficult. For example, I worked for the inspectorate in, I would say, FCV, fragile and volatile environment and jurisdiction. And if you be more agile, then you are also opening space for potential corruptive activities, which is another challenge. So in order to, let's say, make that balance between change of laws and bylaws, and if laws are more agile, to, let's say, shift to bylaws and, let's say, regulating at that level and be more dynamic, then capacities of regulators have to be significantly developed. And therefore, we recognize that as one of the key drivers for introducing more agile regulatory approaches, to see how we can systematically develop capacities of regulators and facilitate knowledge sharing between regulators in order to understand new regulatory models and also benefits technology can provide in order to be more agile, more dynamic, and more, I would say, fit into this new digital economy era.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the panelists. I think we learned that there are a lot of opportunities out there with new technologies. We also learned that we have to come back to the basics as well, that if we don't really know what problem we are addressing, then it's very hard to find the right data for it. And I would like to very warmly thank the panelists for sharing their expertise with us, and give them a nice hand. And now break for your well-deserved coffee. It would be great if you could all be back in this room by around 11:25 so that we can start sharp on 11:30 for the next session. Thank you so much. Thank you. This was great. Wonderful.